Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And among all the horrors that plague humanity's struggling empire, few threats are as persistent, as numerous, or as utterly unstoppable as the green-skinned menace known as the Orks. They are not simply aliens. They are not merely warriors. The Orks represent something far more fundamental, far more ancient, and far more terrible than most imperial citizens could ever comprehend. They are living weapons, biological engines of destruction that were forged in fires that burned millions of years before the first human ancestors crawled from the primordial soup of ancient terror. To understand the Orks is to peer back through the mists of time to an age when gods walked among the stars, when civilizations rose and fell with such frequency that entire species were born, flourished, and vanished into extinction within the span of what we would consider a single era. The Orks are survivors of that ancient age. They are the inheritors of a legacy written in violence and sealed with the blood of countless worlds. And yet, for all their brutality, for all their apparent simplicity, the Orks remain one of the most successful species in the entire galaxy, outnumbering perhaps every other sentient race, save possibly the all-consuming Tyranids. Their story begins not in the present darkness, but in an age so ancient that the very stars themselves were younger, when the galaxy was a very different place, contested by beings of such power that their conflicts would shape the fundamental nature of reality itself for millions of years to come. This is the story of the Orks, from their inception as the mightiest warriors ever created, through their slow devolution into the brutal, savage hordes we know today, to their current status as one of the greatest threats facing the Imperium of man. It is a tale of creation and destruction, of glory lost and violence eternal, of a species that was designed for war and has known nothing else for over 60 million years. The greenskins march across a million worlds, their numbers beyond counting, their appetite for battle never satisfied. They are the antithesis of civilization, the negation of progress, the eternal enemy that can never be truly defeated because they reproduce through spores that survive virtually any environment. Kill an Ork, and 10 more will eventually grow from the spores released by its death. Cleanse a world of Orks, and centuries later they will return, spawned from spores that lay dormant in the soil, waiting for their moment to bloom into fresh violence. But the Orks we face today are pale shadows of what they once were. The ancient texts speak of beings called the Krork, warriors of such power and sophistication that they stood as tall as the mighty titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus, clad in power armor so advanced that even the tech priests of Mars would weep to behold it. These were not the crude, barbaric savages that currently plague the Imperium. These were intelligent, organized, technologically advanced super soldiers, created by masters of genetic manipulation who understood the fundamental building blocks of life itself in ways that modern science can barely comprehend. How did these mighty Krork become the Orks we know today? What cataclysmic events transformed the galaxy's most advanced biological weapons into what imperial scholars dismissively call primitive barbarians? And more importantly, are the Orks even now beginning to remember what they once were? There are disturbing signs, whispers among those who study the greenskin menace, that under the right conditions, given enough victories, enough battles, enough time to grow, modern Orks can approach something resembling their ancient glory. The appearance of beings like the Beast in the 32nd Millennium, or the rise of Gazkul Thraka in the present era, suggests that the genetic potential of the Krork still lurks within every Ork, waiting only for the right catalyst to reawaken. The war in heaven and the birth of the Krork. To truly understand the Orks, We must travel back through time to an epoch so distant that it predates the rise of humanity by tens of millions of years. This was the era of the War in Heaven, a conflict so vast and so destructive that its echoes still reverberate through the galaxy today, shaping the very nature of reality itself. It was during this ancient war that the species we now know as the Orks first came into being, though they bore little resemblance to their modern descendants. The War in Heaven was not fought by men, or even by the ancestors of the species we know today. Instead, it was a titanic struggle between beings of godlike power, civilizations so advanced that they had conquered mortality itself and reshaped entire star systems according to their will. On one side stood the Old Ones, an ancient reptilian species whose mastery of biology and the Imperium was unmatched in the galaxy. They traveled through the webway, a network of tunnels they had constructed through the warp that allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances without exposing themselves to the predations of that hellish realm. The Old Ones were the supreme masters of life itself. They had seeded countless worlds with new species, shaped the evolution of entire civilizations, and stood as the undisputed rulers of the physical galaxy. But the Old Ones were not alone in their dominion. In the far reaches of space, another species had arisen, beings known as the Necrontyre. Where the Old Ones were masters of the organic, the Necrontyre were a species plagued by short lifespans and rampant illness. Living on a world bathed in the deadly radiation of their dying sun, the Necrontyre looked upon the Old Ones with envy and hatred, for while they suffered and died in their brief spans of life, the Old Ones seemed to live forever, masters of powers the Necrontyre could never hope to attain. When the Necrontyre begged the Old Ones to share their secrets of immortality, to grant them the gift of extended life, the Old Ones refused. This refusal would have consequences that would echo through eternity. The Necrontyre, in their desperation and rage, made a bargain with beings they barely understood. These entities were the Satan, star gods who existed as beings of pure energy, feeding upon the very radiation of stars themselves. The Satan offered the Necrontyre what they desired most, immortality, but the price was terrible beyond measure. The Necrontyre underwent a great transformation, their souls harvested and their bodies replaced with living metal, becoming the Necrons. They gained immortality, but at the cost of their very essence. They became soulless machines, unable to feel emotion or pleasure, bound in eternal servitude to the Khitan who had enslaved them. United under the command of the Satan and transformed into the deathless Necrons, the former Necrontyre launched a war against the Old Ones that would consume the galaxy. The war in heaven had begun, and it would rage for untold millennia, devastating countless star systems and ultimately changing the fundamental nature of the galaxy itself. The Old Ones, despite all their power and knowledge, found themselves hard-pressed by the relentless advance of the Necrons and their Satan masters. The war was total, absolute and utterly destructive. The Necrons possessed technology that could shatter stars and tear holes in reality itself. They wielded weapons that could unmake matter at the subatomic level. Worse still, they began to construct great pylons of blackstone that could seal off the warp from real space, cutting the Old Ones off from the very source of their greatest powers. The Old Ones realized that they could not win this war through conventional means. They needed something new, something that could match the Necrons' sheer destructive power with overwhelming numbers and relentless aggression. They needed biological weapons that could adapt, survive, and most importantly, reproduce rapidly to replace losses that would annihilate any conventional army. In their desperation, the Old Ones turned to their greatest skill, the manipulation of life itself. They began to create new species, warrior races designed specifically to fight in the war in heaven. The first and perhaps most famous of these creations were the Aeldari, the ancestors of the Eldar, beings of immense psychic power and grace, who would go on to dominate the galaxy for millions of years after the war in heaven ended. But the Aeldari, for all their power, were too few in number and too individually precious to serve as the kind of expendable shock troops the Old Ones needed for the grinding meat grinder of galactic warfare. So the Old Ones created another species, one optimized not for elegance or psychic mastery, but for pure, brutal warfare. They created the Krork. These beings were the ultimate expression of biological weapon design, combining massive physical power with surprising intelligence and adaptability. The ancient Krork were enormous, standing up to 12 meters tall in some cases, roughly the height of an Imperial knight or a small titan. They were encased in sophisticated power armor that made even the advanced ceramite plate of the Adeptus Astartes look primitive by comparison. Each Krork was a towering engine of destruction, armed with weapons whose technological sophistication rivaled anything the Aeldari or even the Necrons could produce. But what truly made the Krork formidable was not just their individual power. The Old Ones had programmed vast amounts of technological and tactical knowledge directly into the Krork genetic code. Every Krork was born with an instinctive understanding of how to build, maintain, and operate advanced technology. They understood battlefield tactics and strategy at a level that would shame many of the Imperium's greatest generals. They could coordinate their forces with a sophistication that belied their brutish appearance. And most importantly, they possessed a unique form of Gestalt psychic power that grew stronger the more Krork gathered together, creating a field of psychic energy that could affect reality itself. The Krork were not a subspecies or a variant. They were designed to be a complete ecosystem, a self-sustaining war machine. The Old Ones engineered them to reproduce through spores, meaning that death in battle would only lead to more Krork growing from the ground where they fell. They created smaller subspecies as well, the Gretchen to serve as laborers and servants, the Snotlings for even more menial tasks, and various squid creatures to provide food and other resources. An entire Krorkoid ecosystem could be established on a world with nothing more than a few spores finding purchase in fertile ground. The Krork were unleashed upon the Necrons like a green tide of destruction. They fought with a savage joy that the emotionless Necrons could never understand or predict. Where a Necron warrior would calculate optimal tactics and withdraw if victory seemed unlikely, a Krork would charge forward with absolute certainty in their own superiority, trusting in their incredible resilience and the knowledge that even death would only spawn more warriors to continue the fight. The Krork didn't fear death because their entire existence was built around the concept of eternal warfare. They were the ultimate soldiers, living only for battle, reproducing through violence and deriving what passed for joy from the simple act of fighting. For a time, the Krork and their Aeldari allies turned the tide of the war in heaven. The Necrons, despite all their technological superiority and deathless bodies, found themselves pushed back by the sheer weight of numbers and the relentless aggression of the Krork hordes. Worlds that had been conquered by the Necrons were liberated, often at tremendous cost, but the Krork simply grew more from the spores of the fallen and attacked again. It seemed, for a brief moment in the span of the war, that the Old Ones might actually win. But the war in heaven was taking its toll on more than just the physical galaxy. The psychic powers of the newly created races, particularly the Aeldari, were having an unexpected effect on the warp. The Imperium, once a relatively calm sea of psychic energy, was being roiled by the emotions of trillions of sentient beings engaged in a war of extinction. The warp began to coalesce into entities, proto-demons formed from the fear, rage, and suffering of countless dying souls. These warp entities began to break through into real space, attacking Old One, Necron, and young race alike. The galaxy was being torn apart, not just by the war in heaven itself, but by the consequences of that war manifesting through the warp. In the end, the war in heaven destroyed both sides. The Old Ones were wiped out or fled the galaxy, their great civilization collapsing under the combined weight of Necron attacks and demonic incursions. The C'tan were betrayed by their Necron servants, shattered into shards and imprisoned. The Necrons themselves went into hibernation, hiding in tomb complexes deep beneath the surfaces of dead worlds, waiting for the galaxy to become stable enough for them to reclaim it. The Aeldari inherited the galaxy, building their own great empire in the ruins of the old war. And the Krork, those mighty warriors created for a war that had ended, were left to their own devices. Without the guidance of the Old Ones, without the constant warfare that had kept them at their peak, the Krork began to change. The sophisticated civilization they had maintained during the war in heaven began to collapse. The technology they used became less advanced, not because they forgot how to build it, but because the constant knowledge transfer and innovation that characterized Krork society during the war was no longer necessary. They had been designed to fight and win, not to maintain a peaceful civilization. In the absence of a great enemy to unite against, the Krork began to fight amongst themselves, their societies fragmenting into smaller and smaller groups. Over millions of years, through a process that we can barely understand, the Krork devolved into what we now know as Orks. They lost much of the sophistication and intelligence that had characterized their ancestors. They became smaller, averaging between 2 and 3 meters in height, rather than the towering 12 meters of the ancient Krork. Their technology became cruder, more ramshackle, though it retained that strange quality of actually working, despite appearing to be cobbled together from scrap. Most importantly, they lost the unity and organization that had made them such effective warriors during the war in heaven. But the fundamental nature of the Orks remained unchanged. They were still living weapons, still designed for endless war, still reproducing through spores that could survive almost any environment. The genetic memory, implanted by the Old Ones, was still there, buried deep in their DNA, waiting for the right conditions to express itself once more. The Orks were not gone. They were simply sleeping, waiting for a new age of warfare to awaken the Krork that still lurked within them. From Krork to Ork, the long devolution. The transformation from Krork to Ork represents one of the most fascinating biological mysteries in the galaxy. How does a species engineered to be the ultimate warriors devolve into something that appears, at first glance, to be primitive and barbaric? To understand this transformation, we must first understand what the Krork truly were and what forces shaped their decline over the millions of years following the war in heaven. The Krork were designed with a very specific purpose: to fight and win the war in heaven. Every aspect of their biology, psychology, and culture was optimized for this singular goal. They possessed sophisticated battlefield tactics because they needed to outmaneuver the Necrons. They wielded advanced technology because they needed weapons that could actually harm the living metal of their enemies. They stood 12 meters tall and wore power armor because they needed to match the physical presence of Necron war machines. Most importantly, they were organized and disciplined because uncoordinated mobs, no matter how fierce, would be methodically destroyed by the patient, calculating Necron forces. But what happens to a species designed for total war when that war ends? The war in heaven did not conclude with a peace treaty or a negotiated settlement. It ended in mutual destruction, with both the Old Ones and the C'tan either destroyed or driven from the galaxy. The Necrons went into their long sleep, leaving the galaxy to the younger races. Without their ancient enemies to fight, without the guiding hand of the Old Ones to direct them, the Krork found themselves in a galaxy that no longer needed their specific talents. The process of devolution was not instantaneous. It unfolded over millions of years, shaped by the changing conditions of the galaxy and the fundamental nature of Orkoid biology. The Krork had been designed to be adaptable. Their genetic code containing information that could express itself differently depending on environmental conditions. During the war in heaven, with constant, intense warfare against technologically sophisticated enemies, this genetic code expressed itself as intelligence, organization, and advanced technological capability. But as the Great War ended and the Krork no longer faced existential threats from species as advanced as the Necrons, these traits began to become less prominent. The Krork society began to fragment. Without a unifying enemy, the various Krork factions turned on each other, fighting amongst themselves in endless conflicts that lacked the desperate intensity of the war in heaven. These internal conflicts, while certainly violent, did not require the same level of sophistication that fighting the Necrons had demanded. A Krork. Fighting another Krork did not need 12 meters of height or the most advanced power armor. They did not need complex battlefield tactics when their enemies thought and fought much as they did. Over time, the Krork that survived and thrived were not necessarily the most intelligent or the most technologically advanced, but rather those who could breed fastest and fight hardest in the constant low-level conflicts that characterized post-war in Heaven Krork society. The spore-based reproduction system, one of the Krork's greatest strengths during the War in Heaven, became a contributing factor to their devolution. Each time a Krork died, it released spores that would eventually grow into new Krork, Gretchen, Snotlings, and various squig species. However, the information encoded in these spores was not fixed. It adapted based on the environment and conditions in which the parent Krork had lived. During the War in Heaven, with its constant high-level warfare, spores produced Krork optimized for fighting Necrons. After the war, with nothing but internal conflicts against other Krork, the spores began to produce smaller, less sophisticated variants that were adequate for the reduced threats they faced. This process was gradual but inexorable. Each generation of Krork that grew from spores was slightly less sophisticated than the last, though the changes were so subtle that they would be unnoticeable in any individual lifetime. The great Krork cities and fortresses, marvels of biological engineering and advanced construction, slowly fell into disrepair as the knowledge of how to maintain them became less and less common. The sophisticated power armor was replaced with cruder versions, still effective but far less advanced than what the ancient Krork had worn. The weapons became simpler, easier to manufacture from available materials, rather than requiring the complex resources needed for the most advanced War in Heaven era armaments. But here is where the genius of the Old One's design reveals itself. The Krork never truly disappeared. All the information, all the capability, all the potential of the ancient Krork remained locked within the genetic code of every Ork. Under the right conditions, with sufficient warfare against sophisticated enemies and enough victories to allow individual Orks to grow larger and stronger, the species could begin to approach what they had once been. The transformation from Krork to Ork was not a one-way street, but rather a dynamic process that could be reversed given the proper stimulus. We see evidence of this throughout Ork history. When Ork societies reach a critical mass, when a particularly powerful warlord manages to unite numerous tribes and launch a great crusade of conquest, we see the Orks begin to change. They grow larger. Their technology becomes more sophisticated. Most tellingly, they become more organized and capable of complex strategic thinking. The appearance of the beast in the 32nd millennium represented perhaps the closest the Orks had come to returning to their Krorkish roots since the end of the War in Heaven. The beast and his prime Ork lieutenants were enormous, intelligent, and commanded technology that even the Adeptus Mechanicus found remarkably advanced. They spoke fluent Gothic, formulated sophisticated strategies, and came terrifyingly close to conquering the Imperium itself. The modern Orks, the greenskins that the Imperium faces across 1 million battlefields, represent an equilibrium point in this process of devolution and potential re-evolution. They are sophisticated enough to pose a serious threat, capable of building functioning technology and organizing themselves into coherent fighting forces. Yet they lack the sheer capability and intelligence of the ancient Krork. An average Ork boy stands between 2 and 3 meters tall, far smaller than the towering 12-meter Krork of old. They are aggressive and brutal, living for battle and warfare, but their tactics are often straightforward, favoring overwhelming force and direct assault over subtle strategy. The orc life cycle itself reflects this scaled-down version of Krork society. An orc begins life as a spore, growing in the ground until it emerges as a young orc. The smallest and weakest become Gretchen, doomed to lives of servitude and abuse. Those strong enough become orc boys, the common warriors that make up the bulk of any greenskin horde. An orc boy that survives enough battles and wins enough fights grows larger and stronger, eventually becoming a nob, a leader of lesser orcs. The very largest and strongest become war bosses, capable of dominating entire tribes through sheer physical might and force of personality. And in rare cases, a war boss that wins enough victories and unites enough tribes can grow even larger, approaching the size and capability of the ancient Krork. These are the orcs that change history, the ones like the Beast or Gazgkul Thraka that threaten entire sectors or even the Imperium itself. But even these mighty warlords are shadows of what the Krork once were. The Beast, for all its power and intelligence, was eventually defeated. Gazgkul Thraka, perhaps the most dangerous orc alive in the current millennium, is formidable, but still far smaller and less sophisticated than the ancient Krork. The true Krork, those 12-meter-tall super warriors with their advanced power armor and sophisticated technology, remain a distant memory, a potential that exists within every orc, but which may never be fully realized again. The question that haunts Imperial strategists and xenobiologists is simple. What would happen if the orcs truly returned to their Krork state? What if the greenskins managed to unify, to organize themselves, to remember what they had once been? The answer is almost too terrifying to contemplate. A galaxy filled with 12-meter-tall super soldiers, each wearing power armor superior to anything the Imperium could produce, wielding weapons of devastating power, organized and intelligent enough to coordinate complex military campaigns across multiple sectors simultaneously. It would be, quite possibly, the end of every other species in the galaxy. The ancient Krork had fought the Necrons at the height of their power, and the Satan themselves. Modern orcs, reborn as Krork, would sweep aside the Imperium, the Tau, the Aeldari, and every other species with an ease that is frightening to consider. Fortunately for the galaxy, the very nature of orcs works against such unification. They are fractious by design, more likely to fight amongst themselves than to unite under a single banner. Their warlords rise and fall with regularity, each one building a great horde only to have it fragment upon their death or defeat. The largest green tides in history have been aberrations, brief moments when circumstances align to produce a warlord capable of uniting the disparate orc clans into something resembling a coherent force. These moments have produced some of the greatest crises in Imperial history, but they have always been temporary. The orcs always return to their natural state of chaotic infighting after the great warlord falls. And yet, with each passing century, with each new great crusade launched by an ambitious warlord, with each victory that allows the orcs to grow larger and stronger, we see hints of what they could become. The genetic memory implanted by the old ones remains, waiting, dormant but never truly lost. Every orc carries within them the potential to become a Krork, and every orc horde represents the possibility that this time, under this warlord, they might remember what they were created to be. It is a race against time and circumstance. Will the orcs continue in their devolved state, dangerous but manageable? Or will the right confluence of events trigger the return of the Krork, unleashing upon the galaxy a threat that even the mightiest armies of the Imperium might not be able to stop? Orc biology, psychology, and society. To truly understand the orcs, one must delve into the bizarre and fascinating biology that makes them one of the most successful species in the galaxy. The orcs are not simply aliens with green skin. They are a biological marvel, a self-contained ecosystem wrapped in the guise of a single species. a masterwork of genetic engineering that remains functional millions of years after its creators disappeared from the galaxy. Every aspect of Ork physiology has been carefully designed to create the perfect warrior species, and that design has proven remarkably resilient. At the most fundamental level, an Ork is a symbiotic organism, a fusion of animal and fungal life that works together in perfect harmony. The animal component provides the Ork with its basic body structure, its musculature, its aggressive psychology, and its warrior instincts. The fungal component lives within the Ork's bloodstream and skin, providing several crucial functions that set Orks apart from purely animal-based life forms. This fungal network is what gives Orks their distinctive green coloration, the result of chlorophyll produced by the fungal organisms. More importantly, this fungal component allows Orks to photosynthesize, meaning they can derive energy directly from sunlight. An Ork can survive far longer without food than most species, a tremendous advantage in the grinding campaigns of interstellar warfare, where supply lines are always vulnerable. The Ork circulatory system is unlike that of most other species. Their blood is green, saturated with fungal organisms, and containing high concentrations of chlorophyll, along with trace elements of carbon and copper. This green blood serves multiple purposes beyond simple nutrient transport. It provides the Ork with incredible healing capabilities, with the fungal organisms working to seal wounds and regenerate damaged tissue at a remarkable rate. An injury that would kill or permanently disable most other species might slow an Ork down for a few hours before they're back in fighting condition. Only the most catastrophic injuries, those that destroy major organs or sever limbs, pose any real long-term threat to an Ork's continued survival. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ork biology is their reproductive system, or rather, their complete lack of one in the traditional sense. Orks do not reproduce sexually. They have no need for complicated mating rituals or the biological apparatus required for sexual reproduction.
Okay. The lore is getting quite freaky. Let me give you all my personal opinion for 30 seconds and let's get back to it. You know, I've been studying Warhammer for quite a while, and the Orks have always fascinated me in a way that other factions just don't. There's something genuinely tragic about their story when you think about it. These were once the galaxy's most advanced biological weapons, towering 12-meter tall super soldiers in sophisticated power armor, and now they've devolved into what most people dismiss as comic relief. But here's the thing, that devolution isn't permanent. It can be reversed. Every time a powerful war boss rises, every time the Orks start getting organized, we're seeing glimpses of what they used to be. That's what makes them terrifying to me. They're not just dangerous because they're numerous or tough. They're dangerous because they're one good leader away from remembering what they really are. Anyways, back to the story.
Instead, they reproduce through spores, and this single feature makes them nearly impossible to truly eradicate from a world. An Ork constantly releases spores from its body, microscopic packets of genetic information that drift through the air and settle on the ground. When an Ork dies, particularly in combat, it releases a massive cloud of these spores. These spores lie dormant in the soil, sometimes for years or even decades, until conditions are right for them to germinate. When Ork spores germinate, they don't simply produce more Orks. Instead, they create an entire Orkoid ecosystem. The spores develop into various forms, depending on the genetic triggers within them and the environmental conditions they encounter. Some become snotlings, the smallest and least intelligent Orkoids, barely sentient and used primarily as living tools or simple pets. Others become Gretchen, slightly larger and more intelligent than snotlings, forming the slave caste of Ork society. Still others become the various forms of squigs, symbiotic creatures that serve as everything from food sources to attack animals to living ammunition. And of course, some become Orks themselves. The Ork life cycle is elegantly simple and brutally efficient. A young Ork emerges from the ground already possessing basic knowledge and instincts. It knows how to fight, how to speak the Ork language, and how to function within Ork society. This instinctive knowledge is encoded in the genetic memory implanted by the old ones millions of years ago, passed down through the spores from generation to generation. But this knowledge is not evenly distributed. Some orcs emerge with a natural understanding of how to build and maintain technology. These become mech boys. Others have instinctive medical knowledge, however crude, becoming pain boys. Still others have latent psychic powers that can be awakened through proper stimulus, becoming weird boys. These specialized orcs, collectively known as odd boys, form the technical and specialist castes that keep orc society functioning. An orc's size and strength are not fixed at birth. Rather, they continue to grow throughout their entire lives, and their growth is directly tied to their success in battle and their status within orc hierarchy. An orc that wins fights and demonstrates dominance over other orcs grows larger and stronger. This creates a natural social structure where the biggest orcs are almost always the most successful fighters and therefore the natural leaders. A young orc boy might stand 2 meters tall and weigh perhaps 100 kilograms. A veteran knob, having survived countless battles and asserted dominance over numerous other orcs, might reach 3 or even 4 meters in height and weigh several times as much. The greatest war bosses can grow even larger, approaching or even exceeding 5 meters in height and possessing strength that allows them to tear apart armored vehicles with their bare hands. The orc psychological profile is as fascinating as their biology. Orcs live for war in a way that most other species cannot comprehend. For an orc, combat is not a means to an end. It is not something they do out of necessity or desperation. Combat is the purpose of their existence, the source of their joy, the activity that gives meaning to their lives. An orc denied the opportunity to fight becomes restless and irritable, and prolonged peace can actually make orcs physically weaker and smaller. They require violence the way other species require food or water, not merely as sustenance, but as a fundamental part of their being. This psychology creates a society that is constantly on the edge of violence. Orcs fight with each other almost as much as they fight with external enemies, establishing and maintaining social hierarchies through frequent brawls and contests of strength. An orc is expected to regularly challenge those above them in the hierarchy, trying to prove that they're stronger and more capable. Similarly, those higher in the hierarchy are expected to occasionally beat down uppity underlings to maintain their position. This constant low-level violence keeps orcs in fighting condition and reinforces the social structure based on pure physical dominance. Orc society, such as it is, revolves around a simple principle: might makes right. The biggest, strongest orc is in charge. Full stop. There are no elections, no councils, no committees. Leadership is established through violence and maintained through continued demonstrations of superiority. An orc war boss rules because they can beat anyone who challenges them, and they remain in power only as long as they continue to win fights. This creates a crude but effective meritocracy where actual capability matters more than breeding or political skill. The orcs recognize 2 gods, Gork and Mork, though even they have trouble remembering which is which. According to orc theology, Gork is the god of cunning brutality, while Mork is the god of brutal cunning. The difference, as best as orcs can explain it, is that Gork hits you hard when you're looking, while Mork hits you hard when you're not looking. This theological confusion often leads to fights between orcs who disagree about which god is which, though these fights are undertaken in a spirit of religious devotion rather than any real animosity. After all, both gods love a good scrap, so fighting about them is a form of worship. The worship of Gork and Mork reflects the orc psyche beautifully. They are gods of violence, certainly, but they are also gods who value cleverness and cunning, even if that cunning is typically applied in service of hitting something harder or more effectively. Orcs don't have sophisticated religious ceremonies or lengthy prayer services. They worship through action, through fighting, and winning battles in the names of their gods. The greatest form of worship an orc can perform is to launch a great crusade, gathering numerous tribes and clans into a massive green tide and setting out to conquer as much of the galaxy as possible before something stops them. Orc technology deserves special mention as it operates on principles that would drive Imperial tech priests to madness if they thought about it too long. Orc technology, or technology as they call it, appears to be cobbled together from scrap metal, spare parts, and components that have been torn from the wreckage of other vehicles and machines. An orc weapon might be assembled from bits of Imperial Guard lasgun, pieces of a wrecked truck, components from a destroyed Necron warrior, and various bits of unidentifiable scrap all bolted, welded, and hammered together into something that looks like it shouldn't possibly function. And yet, somehow, it does. The secret lies in the Gestalt psychic field that all orcs generate collectively. This field is not something individual orcs can consciously control or manipulate, with the exception of weird boys who channel this energy into destructive psychic powers. Rather, it's a subconscious effect that grows stronger as more orcs gather together. When enough orcs believe something should work, their collective psychic field makes it work. An orc weapon functions because the orcs believe it should function. The more orcs present, the stronger this effect becomes, which is why orc technology becomes more reliable and more powerful as an orc army grows larger. This same principle applies to the orc obsession with color. Orcs believe that red makes things go faster, and so red orc vehicles actually do move faster than vehicles painted other colors, at least when enough orcs are present to make the belief real. Blue is considered lucky, yellow is associated with wealth and firepower, green is the best color because it's the color of orcs themselves, black is tough, white is dead hard, and purple is sneaky because nobody has ever seen a purple orc. These color associations are more than just cultural preferences. They have actual effects on orc equipment and performance because the collective psychic field makes them real. The orc economy is equally bizarre to outsiders. Orcs use teeth as currency, specifically their own teeth. An orc's teeth grow constantly throughout their life and are periodically shed and replaced, much like the teeth of terrestrial sharks. These teeth, or teeth as orcs call them, serve as the standard medium of exchange in orc society. The beauty of this system is that it's naturally inflation-proof and provides built-in economic equality based on biological factors. An orc can't hoard teeth indefinitely because they decay and lose value over time. An orc can't be permanently destitute because they're always growing new teeth. And an orc that's bigger and stronger generally has bigger teeth and more of them, creating a natural economic system that reinforces the social hierarchy. Orc communication is conducted in a language that linguists have struggled to fully understand, partly because it varies significantly between different orc clans and tribes, and partly because orcs themselves are not particularly concerned with grammatical consistency or clear communication. The orc language, generally referred to as Orcish or Da-Orc tongue, is a rough, guttural language filled with short, punchy words and lots of shouting. Orcs communicate as much through volume and body language as through actual words, and a conversation between orcs often resembles a fight more than a civilized dialogue. Indeed, the line between conversation and combat can be very thin for orcs, with many conversations devolving into friendly brawls or escalating into full-blown fights without anyone involved being particularly concerned about the transition, despite all evidence of their crude and primitive nature. Orcs are surprisingly effective at what they do. Their simple psychology makes them nearly fearless in combat. Their remarkable healing abilities and physical toughness allow them to shrug off wounds that would kill most other species. Their spore-based reproduction means they can recover from even the most devastating defeats, given enough time. And their sheer numbers, combined with their joy in combat, make them a threat that the Imperium can never truly eliminate, only contain and manage. Every world cleansed of orcs is a world where orc spores lie dormant in the soil, waiting for their chance to sprout and begin the cycle of violence anew. The orcs are eternal, inevitable, and unstoppable. They are the perfect warriors, designed by masters of genetic manipulation and proven effective across 60 million years of constant warfare. The Age of Ullanor and the Great Crusade. In the 30th millennium, humanity stood at the pinnacle of its achievements. The Emperor of Mankind had emerged from the shadows, where he had guided humanity's evolution for countless centuries, revealing himself and launching the Great Crusade to reunite the scattered colonies of humanity under the banner of the Imperium. He had created the Primarchs, 20 godlike Genesons who commanded vast legions of space marines. The forces of humanity were expanding outward from terror in all directions, reclaiming lost worlds and bringing them back into the fold of civilization. It was an age of hope, of triumph, of humanity reclaiming its birthright among the stars. But even in this golden age, the orcs remained a constant threat. They infested thousands of worlds, their numbers beyond counting. Their appetite for war never satisfied. Small orc empires rose and fell with regularity as ambitious war bosses gathered their forces and launched raids against human worlds. These were generally considered minor threats, annoyances that could be dealt with by local defense forces or, in more serious cases, by the rapidly expanding Space Marine legions. The orcs were dangerous, certainly, but they were scattered and disorganized, fighting amongst themselves as much as they fought against humanity. And then the Imperium discovered Ullanor. The Ullanor sector was an entire region of space that had fallen under the control of a massive orc empire, one of the largest that humanity had ever encountered. At the center of this empire was the world of Ullanor Prime, capital of an orc domain that stretched across a dozen star systems and included numerous worlds that had once been human colonies. The ruler of this empire was an orc overlord named Orlak Uruk, a war boss of such size and power that even other orcs spoke of him with something approaching awe. Orlak Uruk had done what few orc war bosses ever manage. He had united numerous orc clans and tribes into a coherent fighting force and maintained that unity long enough to build something resembling a true empire. The orcs of Ullanor were more organized, better equipped, and more numerous than any orc force the Imperium had yet encountered. They had fortified their worlds with massive defenses, built fleets of orc warships that could challenge Imperial Navy vessels, and were clearly preparing to expand their empire further into human-controlled space. The discovery of such a massive orc threat could not be ignored. The Ullanor Crusade was planned as one of the largest military operations of the entire Great Crusade, a massive deployment of Imperial forces aimed at breaking the power of Orlak Uruk and reclaiming the Ullanor sector for humanity. The force assembled for this task was staggering in its scope. 100,000 Space Marines were committed to the campaign, drawn primarily from 3 legions: the Lunar Wolves, under their Primarch Horus, the White Scars under Jagatai Khan, and the Ultramarines under Robute Guilliman. These legions were supported by 8 million Imperial Army troops, the regular human soldiers who formed the backbone of the Imperium's military might. 600 starships of the Imperial Navy provided orbital support and transportation, along with 100 Titans of the Legio Mortis, massive walking war machines that stood as tall as buildings and wielded weapons that could level cities. The Emperor himself took personal command of the Ullanor Crusade, accompanied by numerous other Primarchs and his most trusted advisors. This was to be the capstone of the Great Crusade, the final great campaign before the Imperium could focus on consolidating its gains and building the civilization that would endure for all time. The Emperor's presence demonstrated just how seriously the Imperium took the orc threat. This was not a routine campaign, but a war of extinction aimed at destroying the largest orc empire humanity had ever faced. The campaign began with the systematic reclamation of the Ullanor sector's outlying worlds. The White Scars and Ultramarines, supported by newly raised Imperial Army regiments, drove into the sector from multiple directions, clearing Ork forces from world after world. The fighting was brutal and grinding, with the Orks defending every meter of territory with their characteristic ferocity. But the Imperial forces were overwhelming in their power and coordination, and world after world fell back into human hands. Meanwhile, Horus and the Lunar Wolves prepared for the killing blow. The War Master-to-be employed his signature tactical approach, a direct strike at the enemy's command structure. Rather than slowly grinding through the Ork defenses of Ullanor Prime, Horus planned to teleport directly into Uruk-Uruk's fortress palace and kill the Overlord before his subordinates could properly organize a defense. It was a bold plan, one that risked the lives of the Primarch and his elite Justaerin Terminators. But if successful, it would decapitate the Ork Empire in a single stroke. The assault was launched with the precision that would later become synonymous with Horus's command style. Drop pods streamed down from orbit, carrying thousands of Lunar Wolves Space Marines to positions surrounding Uruk-Uruk's fortress. At the same time, Horus and his Justaerin Terminators teleported directly into the heart of the Ork stronghold, their teleportation strike placing them within meters of the Overlord himself. What followed was some of the most intense close-quarters fighting of the entire Great Crusade, with Space Marines and Orks battling through the corridors of the fortress in a chaotic melee. Horus himself confronted Uruk in the Overlord's throne room. The Ork warboss was enormous, even by Ork standards, and fought with the strength and ferocity that had allowed him to dominate all other Orks in the sector. For a time, the outcome of the duel was uncertain. Uruk was no ordinary Ork, and even a Primarch could not casually dismiss such an opponent. But in the end, Horus's superior skill and the blessing of the Emperor prevailed. The Primarch wounded the Overlord severely, then finished him by hurling his body from the roof of the fortress palace, sending the Ork warlord plummeting to his death below. The death of Uruk had exactly the effect Horus had predicted. Ork leadership is based entirely on personal dominance, and when the biggest, strongest Ork is killed, the hierarchy beneath him typically collapses into chaos as subordinates fight amongst themselves to establish a new pecking order. Without their overlord to unite them, the Ork forces across Ullanor Prime and throughout the sector began to fragment. War bosses who had been held in check by Uruk-Uruk's dominance now turned on each other, each seeking to claim leadership for themselves. The unified Ork empire that had threatened human space dissolved into dozens of warring factions. The Imperial forces capitalized on this disarray with ruthless efficiency. Over the following year, they methodically hunted down and destroyed the fragmented Ork forces, reclaiming world after world and executing Ork war bosses wherever they were found. The Ullanor sector, which had represented one of the greatest concentrations of Ork power in the galaxy, was cleansed and brought back under Imperial control. The victory was complete and total, representing what was arguably the greatest triumph of the entire Great Crusade. To commemorate this monumental achievement, the Emperor ordered that a grand triumph be held on Ullanor Prime itself. The Mechanicus was tasked with transforming an entire continent of the world into a massive parade ground. Using geoformer engines and millions of servitors, thralls, and prisoner slaves, they flattened the terrain and laid down a magnificent granite path 5 kilometers wide and 500 kilometers long. The path was decorated along its entire length with the skulls of Ork commanders killed during the campaign, arranged on posts as grim trophies of Imperial victory. The triumph of Ullanor was perhaps the greatest celebration in human history. 8 million Imperial army soldiers marched in formation down the granite path, their armor and weapons gleaming in the light of Ullanor's sun. Thousands of armored vehicles rumbled alongside them, from simple transports to mighty battle tanks. Hundreds of Titans from the Collegia Titanica strode down the parade route, these walking gods of war dwarfing everything around them. 14 of the 20 Space Marine legions were present, their warriors marching in perfect formation, each legion displaying its colors and honors with pride. The Lunar Wolves, renamed the Sons of Horus in honor of the Primarch's victory, marched at the head of this massive force. At the end of the parade route, a citadel had been constructed atop a mountain, providing a vantage point from which to observe the entire spectacle. Here stood the Emperor and his most trusted advisors. 9 Primarchs were present, Horus himself, alongside Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, Mortarion of the Death Guard, Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, Angron of the World Eaters, Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, Lorgar of the Word Bearers, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children. They were joined by Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand and advisor, Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, and numerous other members of the Council of Terror. 2 gold-plated warlord titans stood guard over the citadel, their weapons systems active and ready, despite the celebratory nature of the occasion. The triumph was meant to be a celebration of humanity's greatest victory, a demonstration of the Imperium's power and unity. And in many ways, it succeeded in that goal. The military might on display was staggering, a force capable of conquering entire sectors of space. The Space Marine legions represented the pinnacle of human military achievement, each one a brotherhood of superhuman warriors bound in loyalty to the Emperor and their Primarchs. The victory at Ulanor had proven that no Xenos threat, no matter how numerous or how powerful, could stand against the combined might of the Imperium. But the triumph of Ulanor also marked the beginning of the end for the Emperor's grand vision. At the height of the celebration, before the assembled might of the Imperium, the Emperor made an announcement that shocked everyone present. He declared that he would no longer be leading the Great Crusade directly. Instead, he would return to Terra to pursue a secret project of vital importance to the future of humanity. In his place, he would leave Horus to command the continued expansion of the Imperium. The Emperor granted Horus the newly created rank of War Master, giving him command authority over all the other Primarchs and every expeditionary fleet of the Great Crusade. The Lunar Wolves were renamed the Sons of Horus in recognition of his achievements. Horus was given Worldbreaker, a massive power mace, as a symbol of his new authority. It was the greatest honor the Emperor could bestow, elevating one Primarch above all his brothers and entrusting him with the continued success of humanity's expansion among the stars. But this decision, made in good faith and with the best of intentions, planted the seeds of the catastrophe that would soon engulf the Imperium. Many of the Primarchs felt slighted by Horus's elevation, questioning why they had not been chosen for this honor. More significantly, the Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade, his sudden departure to pursue a project he refused to explain even to his own sons, left the Primarchs feeling abandoned. They had fought for years to reunite humanity under the Emperor's banner, and now, at the moment of their greatest triumph, he was leaving them. The Emperor's secret project was the Imperial Webway, an attempt to construct humanity's own network of safe passages through the warp similar to what the Aeldari had inherited from the Old Ones. If successful, it would allow humanity to travel vast distances without exposing themselves to the dangers of warp travel, potentially freeing the Imperium from its dependence on navigators and psychic communication. It was a project of staggering ambition and importance, one that could have transformed humanity's place in the galaxy. But the Emperor chose not to reveal the nature of this project to his sons, and this secrecy would prove catastrophic. Within years of the triumph at Ulanor, the seeds of doubt and resentment planted by the Emperor's departure would blossom into full betrayal. Horus, corrupted by the powers of chaos, would turn against the Emperor and lead half the Space Marine legions in rebellion. The Horus heresy would nearly destroy the Imperium, resulting in the Emperor's entombment on the Golden Throne and the permanent abandonment of the Imperial Webway project. In retrospect, the triumph of Ulanor represented not the Imperium's greatest victory, but rather the high watermark of humanity's hopes, the moment just before everything began to fall apart. But in that moment, as millions of soldiers marched past and the Primarchs stood in the Emperor's presence, none of them could see the darkness that was coming. They had defeated the greatest Ork empire ever encountered. They had proven humanity's superiority over the Xenos. The future seemed bright, and the Imperium eternal. They could not know that in the grim darkness of the far future, there would be only war, and that the Orks, thought defeated at Ulanor, would return again and again, rising from the spores left in the ground to plague humanity for millennia to come. The Battle of Ulanor was a victory, but it was not an ending. It was merely another chapter in an endless war that would continue long after the heroes of that day had passed into legend or corruption. The beast arises, the greatest threat. 15 centuries passed after the triumph of Ulanor. The Imperium had been devastated by the Horus heresy, torn apart by civil war and betrayal. The Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, neither truly alive nor fully dead. His consciousness focused on maintaining the Astronomicon that guided Imperial ships through the warp. The Space Marine legions had been broken apart in the reforms that followed the heresy, divided into smaller chapters to prevent any single force from having the power to threaten the Imperium as Horus had. The traitor legions had been driven into the Eye of Terror, where they plotted their revenge and launched occasional black crusades against the Imperium. But by the 32nd millennium, the Imperium had largely recovered from the wounds of the heresy. This period, known as the Time of Rebirth, saw humanity prospering as it had not done since before the Great Civil War. Worlds were being reclaimed and rebuilt. Trade flourished along safe warp routes. The Space Marine chapters stood vigilant against external threats, while the Adeptus Custodes guarded Terra itself. Chaos was contained, pushed back to the fringes of the galaxy. Xenos threats, while persistent, seemed manageable. It was an age of relative peace and prosperity, as close to a golden age as the Imperium would ever know again. And then, in 544.M32, the Orks returned to Ulanor. But these were not the disorganized, fragmented greenskins that the Imperium had come to expect. These Orks were organized, disciplined, and technologically sophisticated in ways that defied everything Imperial scholars thought they knew about the species. At their head stood a being known simply as the Beast, and this creature would prove to be the single greatest threat the Imperium had faced since the heresy itself. The first signs of trouble came from the Imperial Fists chapter, descendants of Rogel Dawn's legion and defenders of one of the Imperium's key fortress worlds. They responded to reports of an Ork attack on the world of Ardamantua, expecting to face a standard Ork horde that could be dealt with through superior tactics and firepower. What they found instead was something unprecedented. The Orks they fought were larger than normal, more organized, and far more numerous than intelligence reports had suggested. The Imperial Fists fought with their characteristic determination and skill, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the unexpected sophistication of the Ork attack. The Battle of Ardamantua was a massacre. The Imperial Fists chapter was nearly annihilated, with only a handful of survivors managing to escape. Among them was Captain Corland, who would go on to play a crucial role in the war to come. The loss of nearly an entire Space Marine chapter to a single Ork attack sent shockwaves through the Imperium. This was not supposed to be possible. Orks were dangerous, yes, but they were also predictable and disorganized. An entire Space Marine chapter should have been more than sufficient to handle any Ork threat. The fact that they had been destroyed suggested something terrifying. The Orks had evolved, or perhaps more accurately, had remembered what they had once been. As reports came in from across the Imperium, the scope of the threat became clear. This was not a localized Ork uprising. It was a galactic invasion, a great crusade of conquest led by the beast that dwarfed even the empire of Uruk. Ork attack moons, massive orbital platforms the size of small moons and bristling with weapons, appeared in system after system. These attack moons were technological marvels that the Adeptus Mechanicus had no explanation for. They could teleport entire armies directly to the surface of target worlds, bypassing orbital defenses entirely. They generated gravitational and psychic disruptions that drove populations mad and disrupted Imperial communication and navigation. And they were commanded by Orks who spoke fluent Gothic and demonstrated strategic thinking that would shame many Imperial commanders. The Orks spread like a plague across the Imperium, conquering world after world with terrifying speed. Entire systems fell silent, their populations enslaved or exterminated, their defenses overwhelmed by the green tide. The Imperial response was hampered by political infighting among the High Lords of Terror, who seemed more concerned with maintaining their own power than coordinating an effective defense. The Space Marine chapters, spread thin across the galaxy and divided into autonomous forces, struggled to mount an effective response. The Imperial Guard regiments sent to fight the Orks found themselves facing enemies who were larger, tougher, and better equipped than any Orks they had encountered before. As the crisis deepened, more information about the beast emerged, and each new revelation was more disturbing than the last. The beast was enormous, described in one report as being the size of a hab block, at least 10 meters tall, and encased in sophisticated power armor that would have been the envy of any tech marine. This single fact suggested something that Imperial commanders found almost too terrible to contemplate. The beast was not simply an unusually large Ork warboss. It was something approaching the ancient Krork, the legendary ancestors of the Ork species that had fought in the War in Heaven. The technological sophistication displayed by the beast's forces supported this terrifying conclusion. The Orks, under the beast's command, fielded weapons and vehicles that functioned reliably and demonstrated engineering principles that suggested actual understanding rather than the usual Ork approach of hitting things until they worked. Their attack moons were particularly troubling, combining advanced gravitational manipulation, teleportation technology, and construction techniques that even the Mechanicus couldn't fully analyze. The beast had even constructed massive temple gargants, walking fortresses the size of titans that served as mobile shrines to the Ork gods Gork and Mork. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the revelation that the beast could speak. When an Ork ambassador arrived on Terra itself, demanding the Imperium's surrender, the High Lords were confronted with a greenskin who spoke perfect Gothic and demonstrated a level of intelligence and strategic thinking that Orks were not supposed to possess. The ambassador, identifying itself as Bezrak, calmly explained that the Imperium had been judged and found wanting, that Terra itself would be destroyed, and that humanity would be subjugated or exterminated as the Ork gods willed. The appearance of this ambassador on the throne world itself demonstrated the complete breakdown of Imperial defenses and the catastrophic scope of the crisis. The Imperium's response, when it finally came, was desperate and costly. Captain Corland, one of the few surviving Imperial fists, invoked the Last Wall Protocol, an ancient emergency plan that brought together all the successor chapters of the Imperial Fists Legion. These chapters, normally operating independently, united to form a force that approached Legion strength. Corland was elevated to the rank of Lord Commander of the Imperium, given authority over all Imperial military forces in the struggle against the Beast. The key to defeating the Beast lay in striking at Ullanor Prime, which the Orks had transformed into their capital world. The Beast had rebuilt the planet into a massive urban landscape, covering virtually its entire surface with Ork settlements and fortifications. At the heart of this city stood Gorkogrod, the Beast's capital. where the war boss had constructed a massive temple gargant at the exact location where the Emperor and the Primarchs had stood during the triumph of Ullanor 15 centuries earlier. It was a deliberate insult, a statement that the Orks had reclaimed what had been taken from them and would never relinquish it again. The Imperium launched not one, but 3 separate invasions of Ullanor, each more costly than the last. The first invasion was led by Khorland himself and featured the return of Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamander's Legion, who had been thought lost in the centuries since the heresy. Vulcan was a perpetual, an immortal being who could regenerate from virtually any injury, and his presence gave the Imperial forces hope that they might actually be able to kill the beast. The Battle of Gorkogrod was one of the most intense conflicts in Imperial history. The Imperial forces fought their way through the Ork defenses, battling street by street through a city designed to be a death trap for invaders. The Orks did not fight in the open like they normally would, but instead employed sophisticated urban warfare tactics, ambushing Imperial forces from prepared positions and using the city's layout to their advantage. This demonstrated yet again that the beast's Orks were not the disorganized hordes the Imperium was used to facing, but rather a coordinated military force employing actual strategy. When the Imperial forces finally reached the beast's temple, they discovered something that defied their expectations. The being they had been calling the beast was initially mistaken for a statue. So massive and still was it. But when it moved, when it spoke, when it engaged the Primarch Vulcan in single combat, the Imperials realized they were facing something that approached the legendary Krork of ancient times. The beast fought with the strength and skill of a demigod, matching Vulcan blow for blow despite the Primarch's considerable advantages. Vulcan eventually managed to kill the beast, or so it seemed, using his immense strength and the advantage of his regenerative abilities to outlast the Ork warlord. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The beast had delayed the Imperial forces long enough for its true plan to come to fruition. Ullanor Prime itself had been converted into a massive weapon, a planet-sized attack moon capable of teleporting directly to Terra and destroying the throne world. Only desperate action by the Imperial forces, including Vulcan's sacrifice of his own immortal life to trigger a massive psychic backlash, prevented this catastrophe. And then came the revelation that shattered what little hope the Imperials had left. The beast they had killed was not the beast. Or rather, it was one of multiple beasts. Investigation revealed that there were 6 of these prime orks, each commanding what amounted to a legion of orks, and each bearing the title of the beast. They were apparently all at a similar stage of evolution, approaching true Krork status, and they coordinated their efforts with a sophistication that suggested genuine strategic intelligence. The beast that Vulcan had fought and killed was simply one among equals, and the death of one had not significantly impacted the overall Ork command structure. The second invasion of Ullanor met with similar results. Khorland led another assault, this time armed with a captured Ork Psyker and a force of Sisters of Silence. The plan was to use these assets to create a psychic disruption that would function as a reverse horde, weakening the Orks by disrupting the Gestalt psychic field that gave them strength. The plan worked, to an extent. One of the beasts was killed by the psychic backlash, but Khorland himself fell in battle, killed by yet another of the prime orks that emerged to take command after its sibling's death. The third and final invasion of Ullanor was led by Maximus Thane, chapter master of the Fist's Exemplar and one of the last remaining warriors from the last Wall Force. This time, the Imperium employed the most extreme measures imaginable. They redirected asteroids to bombard Ullanor Prime from orbit, devastating the planet's surface and destroying much of the Ork city that had been built there. Then, using the same technique that had worked in the second invasion, they launched a final assault with Sisters of Silence and the captured Ork Psyker to disrupt the beast's psychic connection to their forces. The final battle saw the death of the largest and most powerful of the beasts. the one that seemed to serve as the leader of the group. With its death, the coordination among the Ork forces collapsed. The remaining Prime Orks were hunted down and killed by Imperial forces across the galaxy. The Great Crusade that had threatened to conquer the entire Imperium fragmented into dozens of smaller forces, reverting to the typical Ork behavior of infighting and disorganization. The War of the Beast ended with Imperial victory, but at a terrible cost. Entire chapters of Space Marines had been annihilated. Billions of Imperial citizens had died. Hundreds of worlds had been devastated or lost entirely. The High Lords of Terror had been purged, with Grandmaster Draken Vangerich of the Officio Assassinorum executing most of them for their incompetence and corruption during the crisis. The Space Marine chapters had been forced to cooperate in ways they never had before, and this cooperation led to the creation of the Death Watch, a special chapter composed of veterans from many different chapters who would specialize in fighting Xenos threats. In the aftermath of the war, the Imperium took steps to ensure that such a threat could never arise again. Lord Commander Thane ordered the Adeptus Mechanicus to perform exterminatus on Ulanor Prime, completely destroying the world to prevent the Orks from ever returning. But Fabricator General Kubik, seeing the opportunity to study the advanced Ork technology left on the world, secretly refused to carry out this order. Instead, he used reverse-engineered Ork teleportation technology to teleport the entire planet to a secret location in Segmentum Solar, where it could be studied and its secrets extracted. This decision would have consequences that would echo through the millennia. The world that had been Ulanor Prime would be rediscovered thousands of years later. By that time, it would be known by a different name, one that would become synonymous with some of the bloodiest conflicts in Imperial history. That world was Armageddon, and its curse would continue to plague the Imperium for millennia to come. The War of the Beast demonstrated something that Imperial scholars had tried to deny. The Orks were not simply primitive savages to be dismissed. Under the right conditions, with the right leadership, they could approach or even achieve the status of Krork, the ancient super warriors created by the Old Ones. The fact that 6 Prime Orks had arisen simultaneously suggested that this evolution was not a random mutation, but rather a genetic program that activated when Ork populations reached critical mass and found themselves in sufficient warfare. If one beast could arise, others could follow. And if the Orks ever truly united under a single leader who reached full Krork status, they might become unstoppable. The 6 great clans. Ork society, chaotic and violent as it is, still maintains certain organizational structures that help define how different groups of greenskins approach warfare and life. The most important of these structures are the clans, or clans as they're rendered in Imperial Gothic. While there are numerous small clans scattered across the galaxy, 6 major clans are universally recognized wherever Orks are found. These are the Goths, the Evil Suns, the Bad Moons, the Death Skulls, the Blood Axes, and the Snakebites. Each clan has its own distinct culture, preferred tactics, and philosophy, such as Orks have philosophies. Understanding these clans provides crucial insight into how Orks organize themselves and fight. The Goths are perhaps the most stereotypically Orky of all the clans. They are the biggest, meanest, most aggressive Orks in the galaxy, and they're proud of it. For a Goth, there is no greater pleasure than getting into close combat and beating an enemy to death with their bare hands or with simple, brutal melee weapons. Goths view complicated strategies, ranged weapons, and anything that doesn't involve direct physical violence as inherently weak and un-Orky. They prefer to settle everything through straightforward brawls, and they have nothing but contempt for Orks who rely on sneaky tactics or cowardly shooting when they could be getting stuck in with fists and choppers. Goths dress primarily in black, with white checks or minimal other decoration. They consider bright colors to be flashy and un-Orky, suitable only for weaker clans who need to compensate for their inadequacies. A Goth believes in letting their actions speak for themselves. and their actions invariably involve beating someone's face in. Goth knobs almost always wear big horns on their helmets, a visual callback to the ancient Earth myth of horned warriors and a practical tool for headbutting opponents. The Goths' clan symbol is a black bull's head, representing their stubborn, aggressive nature and their preference for charging straight at the enemy. Because Goths are so singularly focused on close combat excellence, they tend to produce the largest and strongest war bosses. Size and strength are how Orks measure worth, and Goths maximize both through constant fighting and an unwavering commitment to physical dominance. Many of the most famous Ork war bosses in history have been Goths, including Ghazghkull Thraka himself, the most dangerous Ork currently alive in the galaxy. When Goths go to war, they go in strength, bringing massive mobs of boys, all armed with sluggas and choppers, supported by close combat specialists like Nobs and the occasional Deaf Dread for heavy support. The Evil Sons represent the opposite end of the Ork spectrum from the methodical Goths. Where Goths believe in direct combat and brute strength, Evil Sons believe in speed. They are addicted to going fast, obsessed with loud engines and the thrill of racing into battle at maximum velocity. An Evil Sons Ork would rather charge into combat on a speeding warbike than walk, and they paint everything they own red because Orks universally believe that red ones go faster. Strangely enough, in the reality-warping presence of enough Orks, this belief actually makes it true. The Evil Sons have more mech boys than any other clan because they need constant technical support to keep their vehicles running. These mechs are always tinkering with engines, modifying bikes and trucks to squeeze out every possible bit of speed, regardless of whether the vehicle can actually hold together under the increased strain. Evil Sons vehicles are notoriously unreliable and prone to spectacular crashes, but when they work, they're the fastest things on any battlefield. The clan symbol is a blood-red face, grinning out of a sun, and Evil Sons Orks wear red leather, goggles, and other gear associated with speed and driving. Evil Sons tactics revolve around mobility and aggressive forward deployment. They mount their boys in trucks and transports, supported by massive numbers of warbikes and speed freaks who race ahead of the main force to scout and harass the enemy. When Evil Sons attack, they do so with overwhelming speed, hitting the enemy before they can properly prepare defenses and then racing away to hit another target. They are the bane of slow-moving enemies and excel at fighting across open terrain where their superior speed gives them a decisive advantage. The Bad Moons are the richest Orks in the galaxy, and they never let anyone forget it. Bad Moons have teeth that grow faster than other Orks, which in a species that uses teeth as currency means they're perpetually wealthy. This wealth is not considered an unfair advantage by other Orks, because any Ork big and strong enough can simply beat up a Bad Moon and take their teeth. Indeed, this is a common occurrence, which is why Bad Moons tend to be heavily armed and well protected, despite their wealth. Bad Moons use their wealth to acquire the biggest, loudest, flashiest guns they can find. They are obsessed with firepower, operating under the universal Ork belief that you can never have enough Daka. A Bad Moons mob will bristle with shooters, big shooters, mega shooters, and any other kind of gun they can trade for or steal. They hire other Orks to carry their ammunition, maintain their weapons, and generally do all the tedious work that lets them focus on the important business of shooting things. Bad Moons dress in yellow and black, often with gold trim, and they love displaying their wealth through ostentatious decoration and equipment. The clan symbol of the Bad Moons is, appropriately, a crescent moon, and they take pride in being the flashiest and most well-equipped Orks around. Other clans consider them a bit snooty and pretentious, always showing off their latest weapons and bragging about how much they paid for them. But no one can deny that Bad Moons bring serious firepower to any battle, and their mobs lay down such volumes of fire that they can shred enemy formations through sheer weight of ammunition. The Death Skulls are the looters and scavengers of Orc society, and they're proud of it. Death Skulls believe that anything not nailed down is theirs for the taking, and anything that is nailed down just needs a bit more effort to liberate. They descend on battlefields after the fighting is done, stripping bodies of useful equipment, scavenging parts from destroyed vehicles, and generally collecting anything that might be remotely useful. They even steal from other Orcs, which has earned them a reputation as thieving gits, though they view it more as proper redistribution of underutilized resources to those who can make better use of them. Death Skulls paint themselves blue because they believe blue is a lucky color, and luck seems to follow them. Whether it's finding the best loot, surviving situations that should have killed them, or having their ramshackle equipment actually work when it shouldn't, Death Skulls have a reputation for being fortunate. Their clan symbol is a horned skull, and they often decorate themselves with bones, skulls, and other trophies collected from the battlefield. Because of their scavenging nature, Death Skulls have the most diverse and eclectic equipment of any Orc clan. A Death Skulls mob might field weapons and vehicles from a dozen different sources, all cobbled together and modified to work despite having no business functioning at all. Their mech boys are highly skilled at improvisation and adaptation, able to combine incompatible technologies into working equipment through a combination of technical knowledge, brute force, and the collective psychic field that makes Orc technology work. Death Skulls armies tend to be heavily mechanized, with lots of looted vehicles and custom contraptions built from scavenged parts. The Blood Axes are the most controversial of all Orc clans because they've learned tactics and strategies from fighting humans. Where other Orcs charge straight at the enemy and trust in their superior toughness and numbers to win, Blood Axes use cover, plan their attacks, sometimes even retreat when situations turn against them. This pragmatic approach to warfare is considered deeply un-Orky by other clans, who refer to Blood Axes as sneaky gits and question their commitment to proper Orky values. Blood Axes wear camouflage, use scouts, and employ actual battlefield tactics rather than simply charging forward and hitting things. They are more likely to work with or even for humans when it suits their purposes, serving as mercenaries or guides in exchange for weapons and equipment. This willingness to cooperate with other species, particularly humans, further damages their reputation among other Orcs. However, what Blood Axes lose in respect they gain in effectiveness, and their willingness to adapt and learn from enemies makes them dangerous opponents. The clan colours of Blood Axes are camouflage patterns, usually in browns and greens, with some red accents. They favour military-style organisation and equipment, often using looted Imperial vehicles and weapons. Blood Axes are more likely to include special forces like commandos, Orc specialists trained in stealth and sabotage. While their approach to warfare is unorthodox by Orc standards, it works, and Blood Axes have won victories that pure aggression could never achieve. The Snakebites represent the most traditionalist faction of Orc society. They shun advanced technology, preferring simple, reliable equipment and traditional Orc ways. Where other Orcs ride in trucks and battle wagons, Snakebites ride into battle on fierce war boars. Where other Orcs use advanced weapons maintained by mech boys, Snakebites prefer simple choppers, spears, and basic shooters that any Orc can fix. They view technological advancement as a corruption of proper Orky values and maintain a culture closer to what Orcs might have been like in ancient times. Snakebites dress in furs, hides, and primitive clothing, often decorated with tribal tattoos and war paint. Their clan symbol is a snake, representing both their name and their connection to the wild, untamed aspects of Orc nature. They are distinguished by their somewhat backward appearance compared to other Orcs, looking more like feral savages than the industrial warriors of other clans. This primitive appearance is deceptive, as snakebites are just as dangerous as any other Orcs, and their experience living off the land makes them incredibly resilient. Snakebite warbands have higher concentrations of weird boys than other clans, perhaps because their rejection of technology forces them to rely more on the psychic powers that are part of every Ork's heritage. They also maintain closer relationships with various squigs and other Orkoid creatures, using them as mounts, weapons, and even companions. A snakebite's army is a sight to behold, with massive mobs of boys charging forward alongside cavalry mounted on boars and squigs, all of them eschewing modern conveniences in favor of the brutal simplicity of direct physical violence. In addition to these 6 major clans, there are numerous smaller clans, and the freebooters, Orks, who have left or been exiled from their original clans and now operate as space pirates and mercenaries. Freebooters aren't bound by clan traditions or colors, wearing whatever they want and following whatever warlord can provide the best fights and the most loot. They are typically more individualistic than other Orks, though they still follow the basic Ork principle that might makes right. Freebooters can be found across the galaxy, raiding shipping lanes, hiring themselves out to various warlords, and generally causing mayhem wherever they go. These clans exist across the galaxy, wherever Orks are found, and most large Ork gatherings will include representatives from multiple clans. A typical Ork horde might have a core of Goths for close combat, evil suns providing fast attack elements, bad moons supplying heavy firepower, death skulls maintaining vehicles and equipment, and perhaps a few blood axes or snakebites adding their particular specialties. The clans don't always get along perfectly, with frequent brawls breaking out over clan pride and philosophical differences about the proper way to be Orky. But when they fight together under a strong war boss, they create a combined arms force that can threaten even the most prepared enemies. The existence of clans adds a layer of complexity to Ork society that outsiders often miss. While Orks appear chaotic and disorganized, they actually have sophisticated social structures based on practical considerations of specialization and strength. Each clan fills a particular role in the broader Ork ecosystem, and together they create a species that can adapt to virtually any challenge and any enemy. Whether you face a Goth horde charging across open ground, an evil sun's speed assault, or a blood axe's infiltration, the result is the same. The Orks are coming, and they're bringing violence with them. Gaz-Kul Thraka, the modern prophet. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, one name strikes fear into the hearts of Imperial commanders across the galaxy. Gaz-Kul Mag, Uruk Thraka. This Ork warboss, prophet of the gods, Gork and Mork, has orchestrated some of the largest and most devastating Ork invasions in recent Imperial history. He is, by any measure, the most dangerous Ork alive, a being who may be approaching the level of the ancient beast, perhaps even on his way to becoming a true Krork once more. His story is one of religious visions, tactical genius, and an ambition that encompasses nothing less than the conquest of the entire galaxy. Gaz-Kul's origins were unremarkable by Ork standards. He was born, or rather grew from a spore, on the world of Urk, part of the Death Skulls clan initially, before joining the Goths. For years, he was just another Ork boy, fighting and killing and growing larger as Orks do. But everything changed during a raid by Space Marines of an unknown chapter who were attempting to disrupt the Ork forces building up on Urk. During the battle, a bolter round struck Gaz-Kul in the head, tearing through his skull and destroying approximately 30% of his cranium while pulping a significant portion of his brain. By all rights, this injury should have killed him. Even for an Ork, with their remarkable healing abilities and resilient physiology, such catastrophic brain damage is usually fatal. But Gaz-Kul was found by Mad Doc Grotznik, one of the most infamous painboys in Ork history. Grotznik, with his characteristic enthusiasm for surgery and his complete disregard for whether his patients wanted or needed the procedures he performed on them, rebuilt Gaz-Kul's skull using adamantium plating. The operation was technically successful in that Gaz-Kul survived, but it had an unexpected side effect, something about the adamantium plate, the brain damage, or the surgery itself awakened latent psychic powers within Gazkul. From that moment forward, Gazkul claimed to receive visions from Gork and Mork themselves. The Ork gods spoke to him, he said, telling him that the Orks had grown weak and forgotten their true purpose. They were meant to conquer the galaxy, to bring all other species under Ork dominance, but they had become distracted by petty internal conflicts and small-scale raids. The gods had chosen Gazkul to remind the Orks of their destiny, to unite the clans and launch a great crusade that would restore the Greenskins to their rightful place as the dominant species in the galaxy. Whether these visions were genuine divine communication, the result of his psychic powers manifesting in religious terms, or simply delusions brought on by catastrophic brain damage is impossible to determine. What matters is that Gazgakul believed them absolutely, and his conviction was so powerful that other Orks believed them too. Within 6 years of his injury, Gazgakul had risen from common Ork boy to war boss of his tribe, having defeated all challengers through a combination of personal combat prowess, growing size, and the force of his personality. The opportunity for Gazkul to prove himself on a larger stage came in 939.M41. Urk's sun was dying, its increasingly unstable emissions causing radiation deaths among the Ork population. At the same time, a massive space hulk appeared in orbit around the planet. Space hulks are conglomerations of ships and debris that have been fused together by exposure to the warp, drifting through space until they randomly emerge into real space. This particular hulk was enormous, large enough to transport millions of Orks, and Gazkul saw it as a sign from the gods. Gazkul united the 4 major Ork tribes on Urk, convincing them to follow him onto the space hulk and escape their dying world. This was no small feat, as Ork tribes rarely cooperate without one warboss physically dominating all the others. But Gazkul's religious conviction and growing reputation as a prophet made other warbosses willing to follow him, at least temporarily. The combined Ork force boarded the hulk and left Urk behind, drifting through the warp toward whatever destination the gods had planned for them. The journey through the warp was eventful in ways that only Orks could handle. The space hulk's Geller field, the protective bubble that shields ships from the warp's predations, failed multiple times during the voyage. Each failure opened the hulk to invasion by demons, warp entities that poured in to slaughter the Orks. But rather than being destroyed, the Orks fought back with their characteristic ferocity, driving the demons off and growing stronger from the constant combat. The journey that might have destroyed any other species only made Gazkul's forces more experienced and battle-hardened. The space hulk eventually emerged from the warp near the Armageddon system. Whether this was Gazkul's plan, the will of the Ork gods, or simply random chance is unclear. What is clear is that Gazkul recognized the system's importance immediately. Armageddon was a hive world, one of the Imperium's most important manufacturing centers, producing vast quantities of military equipment and ammunition. Conquering Armageddon would deal a significant blow to the Imperium's industrial capacity, while providing the Orks with a world-sized factory to produce their own weapons and vehicles. The Second War for Armageddon began on the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 941.M41, when Gazkul's forces disembarked from the space hulk and launched their invasion. The attack caught the Imperial defenders almost completely off guard. The space hulk's weapons had destroyed most of Armageddon's outdated orbital defenses, and by the time the planetary defense forces organized a response, millions of Orks were already on the ground. The war that followed would last for 2 years and become one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern Imperial history. Gazkul demonstrated tactical acumen rarely seen in Ork warlords, using multiple pincer attacks and coordinated strikes to overwhelm Imperial defenses. His forces captured vast swaths of territory, enslaving human populations and using them as forced labor to build more weapons and vehicles. The Imperium rushed reinforcements to Armageddon, including 3 entire Space Marine chapters, the Blood Angels, the Salamanders, and the Ultramarines, along with dozens of Imperial Guard regiments. The hero of the Imperial defense was Commissar Sebastian Yarrick, an officer of the Imperial Guard known for his iron will and refusal to accept defeat. Yarrick took personal command of the defense of Hades' Hive, one of Armageddon's primary population centers. The battle for Hades' Hive was brutal, with orcs and humans fighting street by street, building by building. Yarrick employed every trick and tactic he knew, using the hive's structure against the orcs and inspiring the human defenders to resist beyond what anyone thought possible. In the end, Hades' Hive held, and the orc offensive stalled. Gazgkul's defeat at Hades' Hive marked a turning point in the war. The orcs, having lost momentum and facing increasing imperial resistance, began to fragment. Individual war bosses, seeing that easy victories were no longer available, started pursuing their own agendas. Gazkul himself was reportedly killed in the fighting, struck by a bolter round to his adamantium-plated skull. The orcs, believing their prophet dead, lost cohesion. Within months, the surviving orc forces were driven into the equatorial jungles of Armageddon, where they devolved into a feral state. But Gazkul was not dead. He had survived, and he had learned. The Second War for Armageddon had been his testing ground, his opportunity to learn how the Imperium fought, to understand their tactics and strategies. He spent the next 57 years rebuilding his forces, conducting small raids and attacks across the sector to test new weapons and tactics. He allied with Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, a warlord famous for having the best mech boys in the galaxy, gaining access to advanced teleporter technology that could transport entire armies directly to the surface of target worlds. Gazkul's return to Armageddon came exactly 57 standard years to the day after the start of the Second War, in 998.M41. The Third War for Armageddon began with an orc fleet of unprecedented size emerging into the system, outnumbering the Imperial defenders 6-1. Gazkul had brought 3 other major orc warlords with him: the great despot of Dregruk, Urgok the Unstoppable, and the overfiend of Octarius. Together, they commanded what was arguably the largest orc invasion force assembled since the War of the Beast. The invasion began with orbital bombardment as orc rocks, hollowed-out asteroids fitted with engines and weapons, crashed into Armageddon's surface. Hades' Hive, where Gazkul had been defeated in the previous war, was completely annihilated by a massive asteroid impact in an act of deliberate vengeance. Millions died in the first hours of the invasion. Then came the ground assault, with orc landing craft and teleporter beams depositing millions of greenskins directly into the hive cities and military installations of Armageddon. The Third War for Armageddon would become one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in the Imperium's modern history. The Imperium committed massive forces to the defense of Armageddon, including elements from over 20 Space Marine chapters, hundreds of Imperial Guard regiments, and countless support forces. The Black Templars chapter responded to the crisis in force, bringing 3 full crusades of their warriors to fight the greenskin tide. The Salamanders returned to avenge their defeat in the Second War. The Blood Angels brought entire companies to wage war against the Orks. Even the notoriously reclusive Dark Angels committed forces to the campaign. Commissar Yarrick, now ancient by human standards but still as determined as ever, took the field once again to fight his old nemesis. The duel between Yarrick and Gazkul became legendary, a personal conflict waged across the battlefields of Armageddon. But this time, Gazkul was not the crude warlord who had been defeated at Hades' Hive. He had grown larger, approaching 5 meters in height, and wore massive custom mega armor that enhanced his already formidable strength. He wielded weapons of devastating power, including Mork's Roar, a 4-barreled mega blaster that never ran out of ammunition thanks to his psychic abilities. The war raged across Armageddon's surface for years. Entire hive cities changed hands multiple times. The fighting was so intense that it attracted attention from other threats, including Chaos forces, who saw opportunity in the conflict, and a mysterious Necron presence that had lain hidden beneath the planet's surface for millions of years. At one point, the forces of chaos nearly succeeded in summoning the daemon Primarch Angron to the battlefield, a catastrophe that was only barely averted by the combined efforts of Imperial and, ironically, Ork forces, who both recognized the demonic threat as something that had to be stopped. But Ghazghkull grew bored with the grinding stalemate that developed on Armageddon. He had proven his point, demonstrating that he could threaten one of the Imperium's most important worlds and fight them to a standstill. More importantly, he had received new visions from Gork and Mork, directing him to a greater destiny than simply conquering one world. The gods wanted him to unite all the Orks in the galaxy, to launch the greatest crusade the Greenskins had ever known. Armageddon was merely a stepping stone, a recruiting ground and testing ground for the greater war to come. Ghazghkull left Armageddon, leaving his subordinates to continue the war while he pursued his divine mission. Yarrick, recognizing that killing Ghazghkull was the only way to truly end the Ork threat, pursued him across the galaxy. The chase took them to numerous systems, with Yarrick arriving just in time to find that Ghazghkull had already moved on, leaving devastation in his wake. At one point during the Battle of Golgotha, Yarrick finally caught up with the Ork warlord, only to be captured and tortured for several weeks. But rather than killing his old enemy, Ghazghkull released him, stating that Yarrick was too much fun and that he wanted him alive for the final battle that was to come. Ghazghkull's most recent activities have focused on the Octarius sector, where he has launched his great horde against the Tyranids. This campaign represents perhaps the most disturbing development in Ghazghkull's evolution. By fighting the Tyranids, one of the few species in the galaxy that can match Orks in sheer ferocity and numbers, Ghazghkull is subjecting his forces to exactly the kind of intense, existential warfare that triggers Ork evolution. Every battle against the Tyranids makes the Orks stronger, larger, and more sophisticated. The longer the Octarius War continues, the closer Ghazghkull and his followers get to approaching true Krork status. Current reports suggest that Ghazghkull continues to grow both physically and in power. Each new iteration of his miniature has been larger than the last. And this is not simply artistic license, but reflects actual changes in the lore. He now stands as tall as a Space Marine dreadnought, encased in custom mega armor and wielding weapons that few other Orks could even lift. More disturbing still are reports that he is becoming more intelligent, more strategic, showing signs of the sophistication that characterized the beast and the ancient Krork. Perhaps most terrifying of all is Ghazghkull's goal. He speaks openly of uniting all Orks under his banner, of launching a great crusade that will conquer the entire galaxy. Given what we know about Ork biology and evolution, this is not an empty boast. If Ghazghkull succeeds in uniting even a fraction of the Orks in the galaxy, if he manages to create a green tide large enough to trigger mass evolution toward Krork status, the Imperium might face a threat greater than the Horus Heresy, greater even than the War of the Beast. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka might be the one who finally accomplishes what the Beast failed to achieve, the complete and utter conquest of human civilization. Ork technology and the power of belief. One of the most baffling aspects of Ork civilization, from an Imperial perspective, is their technology. Ork weapons and vehicles appear to be assembled from random scrap metal, spare parts, and components that have no business working together. A typical Ork gun might be welded together from pieces of Imperial Guard laser guns, bits of a chain weapon, components from a destroyed vehicle, and various unidentifiable chunks of metal, all held together with wire, bolts, and liberal applications of what Orks call Mordaka. By all logical principles of engineering and physics, these contraptions should not function. They should explode, fall apart, or simply fail to operate the moment an Ork tries to use them. And yet somehow they work. The secret lies in a phenomenon that Imperial scholars barely understand and the Adeptus Mechanicus refuses to acknowledge: the Gestalt psychic field generated by Ork populations. Every Ork possesses latent psychic abilities. even if they can't consciously control or manifest these powers the way a human psyker or Aeldari Farseer can. When orcs gather in large numbers, their individual psychic signatures combine and amplify each other, creating a field of psychic energy that subtly affects reality. This field makes orc beliefs become real. If enough orcs believe something should work, it works. If enough orcs believe red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles actually do go faster, at least when enough orcs are present to make the belief real. This principle explains much of the apparent paradox of orc technology. An orc mech boy builds a weapon according to his instinctive understanding of how such devices should function, an understanding encoded in his genetic memory by the old ones millions of years ago. The weapon might not work according to standard physical principles, but it works according to orc principles, and in the presence of enough orcs, orc principles are what matter. The collective psychic field bridges the gap between what the weapon should do according to physics and what it actually does according to orc expectations. This is why orc technology functions worse, or not at all, when other species try to use it. Without the Gestalt psychic field to make belief into reality, an orc shooter is just a badly constructed piece of scrap metal that probably won't fire and will definitely explode if it does. But in the hands of an orc, surrounded by other orcs, that same shooter becomes a functional weapon that can kill enemies and make a satisfying amount of noise doing so. The presence of other orcs strengthens the field, which is why orc equipment becomes more reliable and effective the larger the orc force becomes. The process of orc technology creation begins with the mech boys, orcs who emerge from their spores with an instinctive understanding of how to build and maintain equipment. A mech boy doesn't need to study engineering or learn from books. The knowledge is simply there, programmed into their genetic code, waiting to be expressed. When a mech boy looks at a pile of scrap, they instinctively know how those pieces can be assembled into something useful. They understand, at a level below conscious thought, what bits need to go where and how they need to be connected. Mech boys work quickly and without much planning, grabbing pieces and welding or bolting them together in patterns that make sense to them, even if they would baffle any tech priest of the Mechanicus. They don't follow blueprints or detailed schematics. They work by feel and instinct, their hands moving with practiced certainty to create weapons, vehicles, and equipment that shouldn't function but somehow do. And once created, these devices work for other orcs because the collective field makes them work, reinforcing the mech boy's original vision of what the device was supposed to do. Different types of mech boys specialize in different areas. Some focus on building vehicles, creating trucks, battle wagons, and other transport or combat vehicles from whatever materials are available. Others specialize in weapons, designing ever larger and more powerful guns to satisfy the orc belief that you can never have enough Daka. Still others focus on defensive equipment, building force fields, armor plating, and other protective devices. The most talented mech boys, known as big mechs, can create truly impressive pieces of equipment, including massive stompers that rival Imperial Titans in size and firepower, or sophisticated devices like teleporters that can transport entire armies across vast distances. The creation of particularly large or complex devices requires teams of mech boys working together, often with the assistance of numerous Gretchen who serve as laborers and assistants. A stomper, for instance, might be built over weeks or even months, with mechs constantly adding new weapons, armor plates, and systems as inspiration strikes them, or as materials become available. The result is a massive, towering war machine that looks like it was assembled by someone with no understanding of structural engineering or mechanical design, which is more or less accurate, but which functions perfectly well once enough orcs are present to believe it should. Orc vehicles deserve special mention for their complete disregard for safety, efficiency, or aesthetic appeal. An orc truck is essentially a metal box with wheels, an engine, and usually far too many guns mounted wherever they'll fit. There are no seatbelts, airbags, or other safety features because orcs don't care about safety. The engine is probably overpowered and definitely overcomplicated, cobbled together from components from multiple different vehicles. The wheels are mismatched and worn. The steering is loose at best. And yet, when driven by an orc and filled with orcs, the truck works perfectly well, bouncing across terrain at dangerous speeds, while its passengers fire wildly at anything that moves. The orc obsession with color has real effects on their technology, thanks to the Gestalt field. Red vehicles go faster because orcs believe they do. Yellow is associated with bigger explosions and more firepower, so yellow vehicles and weapons hit harder. Blue brings luck, which manifests as increased durability and better fortune in combat. Green, being the color of orcs themselves, is inherently superior and makes everything work better. Black is tough and resilient. White is even tougher, associated with death and the spirits of legendary orc heroes. And purple is sneaky because, as orcs will tell you, you've never seen a purple orc, therefore purple must make things invisible. This last belief is actually self-reinforcing. Since orcs paint things purple specifically to make them sneaky, and since the belief that purple makes things sneaky becomes real in the presence of enough orcs, purple orcs and purple vehicles actually do become harder to spot. It's not true invisibility, but rather a psychic effect that makes enemies less likely to notice them or remember seeing them. This has led to the development of specialized units of purple-painted commandos who use this effect to infiltrate enemy positions, demonstrating that orc beliefs can create functional stealth capabilities from nothing more than a paint job and sufficient collective conviction. The most dramatic example of orc technological capability comes from the War of the Beast, when the prime orcs demonstrated technology that rivaled or exceeded anything the Imperium could produce. The Beast's forces built attack moons, massive orbital platforms that could teleport armies, generate gravitational weapons, and serve as mobile fortresses. They constructed city-spanning temple gargants that were part building and part war machine. They displayed sophistication in design and construction that suggested they had access to knowledge and capabilities that modern orcs had lost. This suggests that the genetic memory implanted by the old ones contains information about truly advanced technology, information that only expresses itself when orcs reach a certain threshold of size and sophistication. The implications of this are staggering. If modern orcs, crude and disorganized as they are, can make their ramshackle technology function through collective belief, what could true Krork accomplish? The ancient Krork had sophisticated power armor and weapons that functioned according to proper physical principles, not merely psychic belief. They understood genuine engineering and scientific principles, but they also possessed the same Gestalt psychic field that modern orcs do. A Krork civilization would combine real technological capability with the reality-warping effects of collective belief, creating devices that would seem like magic to lesser species. This is part of what makes the orcs such a persistent threat. You can't disarm them completely because they can build weapons from almost anything. You can't deny them resources because they can make do with scrap and debris that other species would consider worthless. You can't destroy their industry because every mech boy is a self-contained manufacturing facility who can produce weapons and equipment with minimal tools and materials. And you certainly can't defeat them through technological superiority because they don't care whether something should work according to standard principles. If an orc believes their gun will shoot, and enough other orcs believe the same thing, then the gun will shoot. Physics be damned. The Imperium's response to orc technology has been largely inadequate because they refuse to accept the fundamental principle behind it. The Adeptus Mechanicus in particular struggles with the concept that belief can override physical law, since their entire philosophy is built on the idea that machines work according to immutable principles that must be understood and followed. The very suggestion that orcs can make guns function simply by believing they should is anathema to Mechanicus doctrine, so they dismiss reports of this phenomenon as exaggeration or misunderstanding. This willful blindness prevents the Imperium from developing effective countermeasures against orc technology or from understanding how to truly disrupt orc capability. In the end, orc technology works because it was designed to work, engineered by the old ones millions of years ago to function even under the most adverse conditions, and even when the users had minimal technical knowledge. The genetic programming implanted in every orc ensures that they have the basic understanding needed to maintain a minimal level of technology, while the Gestalt psychic field bridges the gap between what they know and what they need to accomplish. It's a brilliant piece of biological engineering, a self-sustaining system that ensures orcs will always be armed, always be mobile, and always be dangerous, no matter what challenges they face. And it's another reminder that the orcs, for all their apparent simplicity, are in fact one of the most sophisticated biological weapons ever created, still functioning perfectly, millions of years after their creators disappeared from the galaxy. Recent history and current threats. As the 41st millennium draws to its close and the 42nd millennium begins, the orc threat to the Imperium has arguably never been greater. While orcs have always been a persistent problem, recent developments suggest that the greenskins are entering a period of increased activity and capability. Multiple major orc forces are currently active across the galaxy, each one potentially capable of triggering another disaster on the scale of the War of the Beast if left unchecked. The most significant of these threats is Ghazghkull's Great Horde, currently engaged in a massive war in the Octarius sector. This region of space has become a battleground between two of the galaxy's most dangerous species, with orcs and tyranids locked in a conflict of extinction. The Octarius War was initially engineered by Inquisitor Cryptman of the Ordo Xenos, who redirected a Tyranid hive fleet toward the Orc Empire in Octarius, hoping that the two species would destroy each other. In theory, this was a brilliant plan that would eliminate two threats simultaneously. In practice, it may have created the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. The problem is that both orcs and tyranids evolve in response to conflict. Tyranids adapt their biology to counter whatever threats they face, incorporating useful traits from species they consume. Orcs grow larger and more sophisticated when exposed to intense warfare, particularly warfare against worthy opponents. By forcing these two species into direct conflict, Cryptman has created perfect conditions for accelerated evolution on both sides. The Tyranids are developing new adaptations to fight orcs specifically, while the orcs are growing larger and stronger from the constant battle against the most fearsome predators in the galaxy. Ghazghkull himself has been spotted in Octarius, leading his forces personally and demonstrating capabilities that suggest he is approaching true Krork status. Reports indicate that he now stands as tall as a Space Marine dreadnought, and his tactical acumen has reached levels that rival the greatest Imperial commanders. More disturbing still are reports that he psychically visits his forces on Armageddon, projecting his consciousness across the galaxy to provide guidance and maintain control over multiple fronts simultaneously. If accurate, this suggests psychic capabilities far beyond what any modern orc should possess. The Octarius War shows no signs of ending. Instead, it continues to expand, with both orcs and tyranids spreading out from the core conflict to engage each other on surrounding worlds. Orc spores released on worlds invaded by the tyranids create new orc populations that grow rapidly by feeding on the biomass the tyranids leave behind. Meanwhile, Tyranid splinter fleets adapt to fight orcs more effectively and incorporate useful orcoid genetic material into their own biology. The longer this war continues, the more dangerous both species become. Armageddon remains a hotbed of orc activity despite Ghazghkull's departure. The orcs he left behind continue to fight, their numbers constantly replenished by spores and occasionally supplemented by new arrivals who've heard of the great battles taking place on the world. The Third War for Armageddon has lasted for over 2 decades now, making it one of the longest conflicts in modern Imperial history. Entire generations of Imperial Guardsmen have lived their entire military careers fighting on Armageddon, and the Orks show no signs of giving up. The opening of the Great Rift and the beginning of the era Indemitus has further complicated the Ork situation. The massive warp storm that now bisects the galaxy has disrupted Imperial communication and travel, making it harder to coordinate responses to Ork threats. At the same time, the increased warp activity has made Ork weirdboys more powerful, as they can channel more energy from the Gestalt field in the presence of warp turbulence. This has led to the emergence of new Ork tactics, utilizing psychic powers more aggressively than ever before. On the planet Vigilus, a strategically vital world located on one of the few stable routes through the Great Rift, a massive Ork invasion called the Speed Horde has been causing havoc. Led by the speed freak warlord, Kruldaka, these Orks emerged from the rift itself, their forces heavily tilted toward fast-moving vehicles and bikes. The fighting on Vigilus has drawn in forces from across the Imperium, including multiple Space Marine chapters and even a few Primaris Space Marine forces from the new Primaris Marine program. The fact that the Orks are contesting such a strategically important world demonstrates their strategic instincts, whether conscious or unconscious. The beast snaggers represent a recent development in Ork evolution, a new subculture focused on hunting massive creatures and incorporating aspects of their prey into Ork equipment and doctrine. These Orks specialize in fighting large monsters and have developed tactics and equipment specifically for bringing down Tyranids, demon engines, and other massive threats. The rise of the beast snaggers might represent an evolutionary response to the increasing prevalence of super-heavy units on modern battlefields, with the Orks adapting their culture to better fight enemies like knights, titans, and bio-titans. Another concerning development is the increasing frequency of reports about unusually intelligent or sophisticated Orks. While most Orks remain crude and direct, there are growing numbers of war bosses who demonstrate strategic thinking, long-term planning, and even diplomatic skills. Some of these war bosses have been observed negotiating with other species, forming temporary alliances when it suits their purposes, and employing complex multi-stage strategies rather than simple frontal assaults. This suggests that the general level of Ork intelligence may be slowly increasing, perhaps in response to the increasingly dangerous galaxy they inhabit. The frequency of major Ork invasions also appears to be increasing. In addition to the ongoing conflicts on Armageddon, Octarius, and Vigilus, there have been significant Ork attacks on dozens of other worlds. The Sharadon campaign saw massive Ork forces assaulting multiple Imperial worlds simultaneously. The Sanctus Reach system has been under repeated attack by Ork forces for years. Numerous smaller invasions and raids occur constantly across the Imperium, stretching Imperial defenses thin and diverting resources from other threats. The Imperium's response to these threats has been complicated by the broader situation facing humanity. The Indomitus Crusade, led by Primarch Reboot Gilliman, has been focused primarily on restoring Imperial control over worlds lost to chaos, Tyranids, and other threats following the opening of the Great Rift. While the Crusade has achieved significant victories, it has also meant that fewer resources are available to deal with Ork threats in other sectors. The new Primaris Space Marines have proven effective against Orks, their improved size and strength allowing them to match large Orks more effectively than traditional Marines. But there are not yet enough Primaris Marines to deploy everywhere they're needed. The strategic situation is further complicated by the fact that the Imperium cannot afford to ignore any major Ork threat. History has shown repeatedly that allowing Orks to consolidate and grow inevitably leads to disaster. The longer an Ork force remains active, the larger and more dangerous it becomes, both through recruitment of additional Orks and through the biological growth of individual Orks who survive and win battles. Every major Ork invasion in history began as a minor threat that was ignored or inadequately addressed until it was too late. Some Imperial strategists have begun advocating for more aggressive anti-Ork measures, including targeted assassination of particularly dangerous war bosses before they can build up significant forces. The Death Watch has specialized in this approach, deploying small teams of veteran Space Marines to kill Ork leaders before they become too powerful. However, this strategy has its limitations. as killing one war boss often just makes room for another to rise, and the constant conflict actually helps orcs grow stronger rather than weakening them. The true nightmare scenario that keeps Imperial commanders awake at night is the possibility of orc unification. If a war boss powerful enough and charismatic enough emerged to unite significant portions of the orc species under a single banner, the resulting green tide could potentially overwhelm the Imperium entirely. Ghazghkull appears to be working toward exactly this goal, and his increasing power suggests he might actually succeed where others have failed. The question is not whether the Imperium can defeat the orcs entirely, because eradication of a species that reproduces through spores is impossible. The question is whether the Imperium can prevent the orcs from achieving critical mass and triggering the return of something resembling the ancient Krork civilization. Conclusion. The history of the orcs spans more than 60 million years, from their creation as the Krork during the War in Heaven to their current status as one of the most dangerous and persistent threats facing the Imperium of man. They are living weapons, biological engines of destruction that were engineered by masters of genetic manipulation to be the perfect soldiers. Despite millions of years of devolution and the loss of much of their original sophistication, they remain one of the most successful species in the galaxy, outnumbering virtually every other sentient race and spreading across countless worlds. The orcs are eternal. They cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with in any meaningful way. They cannot be permanently defeated because their spore-based reproduction ensures that every world they touch remains infected with the potential for future orc populations. They grow stronger through conflict rather than being weakened by it, meaning that fighting them often produces exactly the conditions that allow them to evolve into more dangerous forms. And they carry within their genetic code the potential to return to their Krork origins, to become once again the 12-meter-tall super warriors who fought the Necrons at the height of their power. The rise of war bosses, like the Beast and Ghazghkull Thraka, demonstrates that this potential is not merely theoretical. Under the right conditions, with sufficient warfare against worthy opponents, modern orcs can approach or even achieve Krork status. Every major orc invasion represents not just an immediate threat, but also the possibility that this might be the invasion that triggers true orc unity and evolution. Every powerful war boss might be the one who finally unites the greenskins and unleashes upon the galaxy a threat that even the combined might of the Imperium cannot stop. The Imperium's struggle against the orcs is not a war that can be won in any conventional sense. It is a war of containment and management, of destroying orc forces before they grow too large, of eliminating dangerous war bosses before they unite too many clans, of cleansing infected worlds before the orc populations become uncontrollable. It is a war that will never end, because the orcs will never end. As long as a single orc spore survives anywhere in the galaxy, the potential exists for the greenskin tide to rise again. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, which means there are always conditions perfect for orcs to thrive. They are the ultimate product of a galaxy at war with itself, a species designed for endless conflict and perfected over millions of years to excel at nothing but fighting. They are crude and brutal and seemingly primitive, but they are also incredibly resilient, remarkably adaptable, and possessed of a biological heritage that makes them perhaps the most dangerous species humanity has ever faced. The question is not whether the orcs will continue to threaten the Imperium. The question is whether humanity can survive long enough to see another peaceful era, or whether the greenskin tide will finally overwhelm the defenses and accomplish what the Horus Heresy, the Age of Apostasy, and countless other disasters have failed to achieve: the complete destruction of the Imperium of man. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of the orcs, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more lore content from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There's always more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and we're here to guide you through it all. Until next time, may the Emperor protect.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.